By the end of the 14th century, Europe was falling apart. Wars raged like wildfires. England and France locked in a fight so long, people started calling it the war that will never end. In dark corners, elderly survivors still whispered about the Black Death, the devastating plague that had collapsed entire villages, leaving silence where laughter used to be. And if war and sickness weren't enough, the skies themselves turned against the people. Harvests failed, hunger spread, families fled their homes in search of bread and hope. It was a time when every sunrise felt like a small miracle, an age when just staying alive was its own kind of victory. Back in 1383, the Iberian Peninsula looked like a patchwork of kingdoms stitched together by war, fate, and ambition. At its heart ruled mighty Castile, the biggest and boldest of them all. Its banners stretched across the plains and mountains of central Iberia, its kings dreaming of glory, conquest, and crowns that could one day rule it all. To the east lay Aragon, not one land but many, bound together under a single crown. A kingdom of traders and sailors, its ships rode the waves of the Mediterranean, carrying silks, spices, and stories from faraway shores. High in the rugged peaks of the Pyrenees, the little kingdom of Navarre clung to life. It was small, almost a whisper compared to its mighty neighbors, but its mountains guarded something priceless, the gateway between Iberia and France. And far to the south stood the Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in all of Western Europe. Once the lands of Al-Andalus had stretched across almost the entire peninsula, but those days were gone. By now, Granada lived under Castile's shadow, clinging to survival. And to the west lay Portugal, a narrow strip of land caught between the roaring Atlantic and the mighty kingdom of Castile. Small in size but fierce in spirit, Portugal had fought hard for its independence and guarded it like a treasure. Far out on the edge of Europe, a storm was brewing in Portugal. The young King Ferdinand I was dead, gone at only 37, and worst of all, he'd left no son to take his place. In a single moment, the proud realm stood on the brink of chaos. Inside the royal court, whispers turned to shouts and shouts to open panic. Nobles plotted, alliances crumbled, and across the land no one knew who would wear the crown or whether Portugal itself would survive the storm that was coming. There was only one heir, Ferdinand's daughter, Princess Beatrice. But Beatrice was married to the King of Castile, the mighty neighbor looming to the east. And that's what terrified people. To many, their marriage looked less like a union of love and more like a trap. In that moment, Portugal looked into the abyss of its own disappearance. The unthinkable was suddenly real. The kingdom that had fought so fiercely for freedom might soon become nothing more than a province of its powerful neighbor. And so began the crisis of 1383, a struggle not just for a crown, but for the very soul of Portugal. But Portugal itself was tearing apart. Inside the royal court it was chaos. Some said, why not join Castile? It's bigger, richer. We will have gold, soldiers, power. But others slammed their fists on the table. Their hearts burned like fire. Join Castile? Never. That would mean kneeling to a foreign king, throwing away 200 years of freedom, pride, and the very soul of Portugal itself. It wasn't just a battle for a crown anymore. It was a battle for who they were. But beyond the palace walls, the air crackled with a very different kind of energy. Lisbon Americans wanted nothing to do with Castile. In the narrow streets, unease gathered like a storm rolling in from the sea. Down by the docks, sailors and fishermen, the lifeblood of the city, huddled in smoky taverns and noisy markets, their voices low but heavy with fear. Would their country disappear? What would become of their homes, their work, their very language? For the people of Portugal, this wasn't about royal bloodlines or golden crowns. It was about survival, about identity and pride, about whether when the sun rose the next morning, there will still be a Portugal. Amid the chaos, one man stepped out from the shadows. John, the master of the Order of Aviz. He was no ordinary rebel. Royal blood flowed in his veins, son of King Peter I, half-brother to the late King Ferdinand, and uncle to Princess Beatrice. He was close enough to the throne to touch it, but never to claim it. By the laws of the realm, the crown could never be his. To the nobles of the court, he was a nobody. Worse than that, a bastard, a pretender, a man meant to fade quietly into the footnotes of history. But history, as it turned out, had other plans. John was not the kind of man to stay in the shadows. He was determined to defy the odds. From childhood, he'd been given the finest education of his time. Everyone knew who son he really was, and whenever he walked into the royal court, his very presence was a quiet reminder of the king's blood running in his veins. Raised as knight from boyhood, he joined the Order of Aviz, a brotherhood of warrior monks, and by his father's command, rose all the way to the top as Grand Master. Royal by blood, hardened by battle, the commander of one of Portugal's finest military orders, a man trained to fight, to lead, and to wait for the moment when destiny finally called his name. And more than any of that, he carried something no treaty could right and no army could take: the trust of the people. In Lisbon streets, in villages, in fields across the land, whispers began to rise, then whispers turned into hope. Could this unlikely bastard become the one to defend Portugal's independence? But John was not alone. Standing beside him was a loyal companion, a man who will soon become a legend: Nuno Álvares Pereira. Born into one of Portugal's oldest noble families, Nuno carried more than noble blood. He carried the courage of a warrior and the instinct of a born commander. At just 13, he had already faced Castilian steel on the battlefield. From that day forward, his brilliance shone brighter with every fight. And in John, he found not just a leader but a kindred spirit, a brother in arms. Nuno will rise to become more than a knight. He will become Portugal's shield. When Nuno pledged himself to John, he was already a warrior far older in spirit than his years. Young in age, yes, but forged in the fire of battle. Yet, what truly set him apart wasn't just the strength of his arm or the sharpness of his sword. It was the blaze of his faith. Nuno was deeply, almost fiercely devout. The chronicles say he prayed before every fight, during the clash of steel, even when death breathed down his neck. While others fought for power or glory, Nuno fought with prayer on his lips and conviction in his heart. To him, war and fate were one and the same. Every charge, every strike, every narrow escape, all guided by the hand of God. For Nuno, this was not a struggle for a throne. It was a holy cause, a battle for God, for honor, and for the very soul of Portugal. With no clear heir to the throne, Portugal stood leaderless, a kingdom without a king. Into that emptiness steps Queen Leonor, the widow of King Ferdinand. She takes the throne as regent, trying to hold the crown steady for her daughter, Princess Beatrice. But in Lisbon, anger simmered like a storm about to break. The people despised her, whispering that she had sold Portugal's soul to Castile, that every order she gave was really the will of a foreign king. Day by day, the fury spread through the streets and markets, through the docks and taverns, and then, at last, the anger erupted. Inside the royal palace, before the stunned eyes of Queen Leonor still flashed, John's men surged forward and struck down Count Andeiro, Castile's closest ally, the queen's trusted advisor, and her lover. In that instant, everything changed. This was no longer diplomacy, no longer politics. This was open rebellion. With the queen's power shattered, Lisbon, the beating heart of Portugal, now fell under John's command. To celebrate John's acclamation, an order rang out across the city. Every church must sound its bells. And soon, the air was alive with ringing, peals echoing from chapel to chapel. All except one. The great cathedral of Lisbon stayed silent, suspicion quickly flaring to rage. The crowd stormed the cathedral, shouting accusation of treason. Chaos erupted. In the violence that followed, the bishop was dragged from the tower and hurled down. It was a brutal warning of how fragile Portugal had become. A kingdom where loyalty and betrayal were no longer settled in courts, but in the fury of the streets. Before long, word from Lisbon reached the King of Castile, and rebellion, as history has shown, always brings retaliation. To the east, the King of Castile made his move. Through his wife, Princess Beatrice, he claimed the crown of Portugal. And behind that claim marched an army, not just any army. Castile was a giant, vast, wealthy, and feared across Europe. Its banner stretched from the mountains to the seas, and now its soldiers marched west. It looked unstoppable. But in Lisbon, John stood his ground. He would not kneel. He called his people to arms: fishermen, farmers, merchants, and knights. A small army, bound not by power or gold, but by fire, faith, and fury. Portugal would not go quietly. On the empty plains of southern Portugal, Nuno stood face to face with the might of Castile's cavalry. Wave after wave of armored horsemen thundered forward, shaking the earth as they charged the Portuguese lines. But Nuno did not flinch. His men held firm. Shields locked, pikes braced, a wall of steel. The cavalry smashed into them. Horses went down. Knights were drawn. Again and again the chargers came, and again they broke. When the dust cleared, the impossible had happened. Castile's cavalry was shattered, and not a single Portuguese soldier had fallen. Nuno knelt and gave thanks and prayed. To him, it was not just a victory, it was a sign. The news of his army's crushing defeat did not sit well with the King of Castile. Enraged, he gathered a massive force and in the summer of 1384 marched on Portugal and laid siege to Lisbon. For 4 long months the city endured. Hunger gnawed, plague spread, but still Lisbon held. In the end it was Castile's camp that broke. Torn apart by famine and disease, without supply routes the invaders were forced to retreat. But the fight was far from over. The next year, on April the 6th, 1385, an assembly of representatives of the states of the realm gathered. In a bold decision, they declared John the new king. King John I of Portugal. The King of Castile was furious. To him, this was rebellion that could only be crushed in blood. Two months later, in the summer of 1385, he returned, not with part of his forces, but with the full might of Castile. This time, it will be war to the finish. And then came the day that will decide the very fate of Portugal. From the east, the Castilian army marched, 30,000 strong. Knights in shining armor, waves of infantry, squadrons of cavalry, a force that looked unstoppable. At his head rode the King of Castile himself, joined by Aragonese and French allies and backed by European mercenaries. Against this giant, Portugal could muster only 6,000 men, and a few hundred English longbowmen at their side. There was a reason King John called on the English longbowmen. By the 14th century, the longbow had transformed war. It wasn't an easy weapon. It took years of practice and tremendous strength to master. But in the hands of the skilled English archers, it was terrifying. A rain of arrows that could pierce armor with deadly accuracy, striking enemies from amazing distances. The alliance with England was no accident. For years the two kingdoms had been tied by treaties of friendship. But now, on the fields of Aljubarrota, that friendship will be tested like never before, and the very fate of Portugal will hang in the balance. As the sun sank low behind the hills, a heavy silence fell over the field. Thousands of men stood waiting, the air thick with fear. Everyone knew it. What happened here will decide the destiny of a kingdom. Along the ridges, English longbowmen took their positions, silent, steady, their bows drawn and arrows glinting in the sun, like 1,000 shards of steel. They waited, hearts pounding for the enemy to come within range. At the center stood the pride of Portugal, the Knights of Aviz, a fierce brotherhood of warrior monks. From childhood they were raised with both prayer and steel, learning to serve God with their faith and defend their land with their swords. At the rear, King John watched, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his banner fluttering in the dying light. At the front, Nuno Álvares Pereira knelt upon the earth, his sword planted in the soil, whispering one last prayer as the Castilian lines began to move. Across the plain, the King of Castile raised his arm, and with that single gesture, the battle for Portugal began. Then it came, a distant rumble that grew into a roar. The earth trembled beneath thousands of pounding hoofs. Across the field, the French heavy cavalry, the finest in all of Europe, lowered their lances, sunlight flashing on their armor. Their war cries tore through the silence as they thundered forward, a wall of steel and fury aimed straight at the heart of the Portuguese line. Armor gleamed, banners snapped in the wind, and the earth trembled beneath their charge. But instead of glory, they rode straight into ruin. Beneath their hooves, the ground betrayed them, trenches, hidden stakes, and deadly pits waiting, like open jaws. Horses screamed and tumbled, throwing their riders into the mud and mayhem. The proud French cavalry, the finest in Europe, crashed and splintered against an invisible wall. Those that managed to escape the hidden trap faced an impenetrable line of steel and spikes led by Nuno himself. What was meant to be Castile's hammer blow shattered into chaos. The unstoppable force had been stopped, cold, broken, and bleeding on the fields of Aljubarrota. Then the sky darkened. Arrows hissed through the air, volley after volley. Long, heavy shafts built to punch through armor and bone. They fell upon the charging cavalry like rain made of iron. Horses screamed and crashed to the ground. Knights crushed beneath their own armor struggled to rise, their shouts drowned by the roar of battle. The English longbowmen had done this before. Veterans of the endless wars in France, they knew exactly how to break a charge, how to turn proud knights into easy prey. And there, on the blood-soaked fields of Aljubarrota, the might of France, fighting as Castile's ally, met his end, shattered in brutal and merciless combat. But the longbow was a cruel weapon, powerful but demanding. Each shot tore at the archer's muscle, each pull heavier than the last. Soon, their arms ached, their breath came in gasps, and the storm of arrows began to slow. Across the field, the Castilian soldiers watched and waited. They could see the rhythm falter, hear the silence between volleys growing longer. Patience was their weapon now, and when the moment came, they would strike. Then came the flood. Wave after wave of Castilian soldiers surged forward, their banners darkening the horizon. Among them marched Aragonese allies and hardened mercenaries, their armor gleaming in the fading light. The roar of their advance rolled across the plain like thunder. To the weary Portuguese ranks, it looked like the sea itself was rising to swallow them all. The clash was brutal, a storm of steel and scream. Swords crashed, shields splintered, and the air filled with the sound of men fighting for their lives. The ground turned slick with blood and mud as bodies fell where they stood. The Portuguese line wavered, bent beneath the weight of the assault, but it did not break. Side by side, farmers, knights, and fishermen stood their ground, their resolve as unyielding as the stone beneath their feet. Against all odds, Portugal held. Slowly, the Castilian advance began to break apart. Funneled between the two creeks, the mighty army found itself trapped, exactly as Nuno had planned. Now everything depended on precision. Nuno at the front commanding the defense with iron discipline. King John at the rear, directing every move like a master at the chessboard. And on that day, they fought as one. The Castilian host was caught in a deadly vice, crushed between the Portuguese lines and the creeks that hemmed them in. Then came the sign-up. King John unleashed his knights, the elite order of Aviz. Heavily armored, they charged like a thunderclap, smashing into the Castilian ranks and cutting them down without mercy. From the ridges above, the English longbowmen rested and ready, struck once more. Their arrows blotted out the sky, tearing through armor and flesh, breaking what remained of Castile's proud army. When the dust settled, the field of Aljubarrota lay silent, carpeted with the fallen. Amid the chaos, the King of Castile saw the truth. The battle was lost. His proud banners lay trampled in the mud, his soldiers scattered and broken. Desperate to save his life, he turned and fled, vanishing into the smoke and ruin. From the ridge, King John watched as Nuno and his vanguard swept through the last pockets of resistance, their blades flashing in the fading light. What had begun as a desperate stand had become a miracle. Portugal, battered, outnumbered, but unbroken, had triumphed. As the sun sank towards the horizon, the battle drew to an end. The mighty Castilian army lay in ruins, broken, exhausted, and scattered across the field. At the very moment of triumph, Nuno dropped to his knees. To him, the victory was not his own, it was the will of God. A victory for his king, a victory for Portugal. By nightfall it was over. The Castilian army shattered and spent broken run. What had marched in with power and pride now fled in chaos and fear. Across the hills of Aljubarrota, the ground was littered with the dead and the dying. Thousands had fallen. As night fell, the horror did not end. The surviving Castilian soldiers were hunted down by villagers. For those too injured to crawl away or pretending dead, a darker fate arrived. In the darkness of the battlefield, wild beasts crept out to feed. From the thousands left wounded on those fields, only a handful will ever see their homes again. Just 2 months after the great victory at Aljubarrota, Nuno Álvares Pereira refused to rest. Victory hadn't tamed him, it had only sharpened his resolve. While others celebrated, Nuno was already planning his next move. He knew the Castilians would regroup, rebuild and retreat, so he decided to strike first, to carry the fight straight into their own land. Without a word to King John, he gathered his men, crossed the border and marched deep into enemy territory to a place called Valverde. When the battle began, it turned ugly fast. The Castilian charge hit like a hammer, and the Portuguese line buckled under the back. Shields splintered, men cried out, and the ground shook beneath the clash of steel. For a moment, it seemed the tide had turned, that Portugal's luck had finally run out. And then, Nuno was gone. No one knew where their commander had gone, whether he had fallen, fled, or vanished into the chaos. Fear rippled through the ranks as the Castilian assault pressed harder and harder, threatening to break them once and for all. Panic swept through his men. Where was their leader? Had he fallen? Had he fled? Then, someone spotted him, not fighting, but kneeling between 2 huge boulders, deep in prayer, as if the chaos of battle didn't even exist. His soldiers shouted over the chaos, desperate and breathless. "The fight is slipping away, we need you, my lord." But Nuno only raised his hand, and the cries fell silent. Then, at last, he rose. His armor was battered, his face streaked with dust and sweat, but his eyes blazed with an unshakable resolve. He gave the signal. A few calm, sharp commands, and the Portuguese line came alive. With a roar, they surged forward, striking back with the fury of men who refused to die. The Castilians reeled, broke, and ran. Against all odds, on that day, Valverde was theirs. From that day on, the Castilian soldiers learned to fear his name. They no longer dared to meet Nuno Álvares Pereira in open battle. Instead, they kept to the shadows, small raids along the frontier, quick strikes, and faster retreats. They knew the truth whispered across the border. If Nuno was leading the Portuguese, defeat was almost certain. Against overwhelming odds, Portugal had done the impossible. 2 crushing victories in just 2 months. The Castilian army was shattered, its soldiers beaten down, its spirits broken. But this was more than triumph on the battlefield. It was the birth cry of a nation, proof that Portugal would not be swallowed by its powerful neighbor. And at the center of it all stood 2 men, bound by faith and friendship. John and Nuno, the architects of Portugal's survival. These 2 victories confirmed John as the rightful king of Portugal, and with him, a new chapter began. Power always brings temptation, and King John was no exception. In Portugal, he was hailed as a hero, the savior who had secured the nation's freedom. But beyond Portugal's borders, something else was stirring. John's gaze turned outward, across the sea. His ambition, once forging war, now pointed towards an empire. The kingdom that had fought so hard to survive was about to change forever, stepping into a new and unsettling future that will open new horizons, but will also bring conquest, slavery, and the suffering of countless people. The year was 1415. For years, King John of Portugal had dreamed of this moment, planned it down to the last detail. His eyes burned with ambition, fixed on a single target, Ceuta, the mighty Muslim fortress city on the northern coast of Africa. A place so heavily defended that most call it untouchable. But impossible was never a word for King John. To him, Ceuta was more than a city. It was a gateway. Whoever held it controlled the trade routes of the Mediterranean and beyond. And for John, it was the first stone in the foundation of an empire that would stretch far past the horizon. By then he had the backing of every noble house and the adoration of his people. He was a national hero, a living legend, the warrior king who saved Portugal, now ready to lead it to a new age. After years of preparation, the Portuguese armada stood ready. For the first time, Portugal was about to cross the sea and change history. The Portuguese fleet reached the shores of Ceuta. The sun blazed above the fortress wall as King John gave the order to attack. And at the very front leading the charge rode a man already whispered about as a living legend, Nuno Álvares Pereira. He was 55 years old, an age when most knights were long dead, broken, or forgotten, but not Nuno. Too old to bear the crushing weight of full armor, he entered the battle wearing only a light coat of mail, his sword gleaming in the morning light, no heavy shield, no shining blade, only his faith, his courage, and the fire of destiny that seemed to burn around him wherever he went. When the charge began, Nuno didn't hesitate. As always, he was the first to move, the first to face the storm. With his sword raised high, he sprinted toward the enemy line, the wind whipping his cloak as his men surged after him. Their battle cry rolled across the sands and crashed against the fortress walls of Ceuta, like thunder. The stone trembled, the defenders faltered, and at the front of it all was Nuno, fearless, unstoppable, leading by example as he had all his life. The assault was fierce, relentless, and by nightfall Ceuta had fallen. In a single day the mighty fortress that had stood for centuries was taken. But this was more than a victory. It was a turning point. The moment when a small kingdom on the edge of Europe looked beyond its own shores and saw the world waiting. When the Portuguese stormed those walls, they didn't just conquer a city. They lit a flame, one that would drive them across uncharted seas, toward new worlds and unknown horizons. A new chapter of history had begun. But in Africa something changed. Perhaps it was the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. Perhaps the distance from home, from the land and people he had fought to protect, made him feel further from God himself. Nuno Álvares Pereira had given everything. He had served his king, his country, and his faith with unshakable devotion. He had won every single battle, defied every odd, and secured the future of a nation. And now, his sword was finally still. After Ceuta, Nuno made his choice. From the day forward, he would serve only God. With Ceuta conquered, Nuno Álvares Pereira returned home to Portugal, and there he laid down his sword. He turned his back on war, on glory, on the roar of battle that had defined his life. Instead, he chose the stillness of prayer, the humility of faith, and the peace he had long denied himself. History will remember him as the undefeated commander, the man who led outnumbered armies to victory and always rode at the front beside his men. But he will remember something greater still, that after a lifetime of blood, Nuno chose peace. Despite his power, fame, and wealth, Nuno chose the path of humility. He gave freely to monasteries, to churches, and to the poor who had nothing. After his wife passed away, he went even further. He surrendered his vast estates to the crown, and then, in a final act of devotion, he joined the Carmelite order in Lisbon, entering a monastery that he himself helped to found. There, he took a new name, Friar Nuno of St. Mary. From then on, he lived in prayer, in service, and in simplicity. One day, the Castilian ambassador came to visit the legendary Friar Nuno at the monastery. By then, Nuno was already an old man. With a half smile, the ambassador tried to tease him, asking what he would do if Castile ever decided to invade Portugal again. Nuno quickly rose and revealed that beneath his monk habit he still wore a coat of mail, the very one he had worn in Ceuta. Even in his final years, he remained ready to defend Portugal with his life. In the final years of his life, King John, by then an old man himself, often made his way to the quiet monastery in Lisbon. He didn't walk in as a king, he came in as a brother. To King John, Nuno wasn't a legend. He was the man who had fought and bled at his side, the one who had helped him win at the crown, the friend who never once abandoned him, no matter how fierce the battle. On November 1st, 1431, King John sat by Nuno's side as Nuno breathed his last. At 71 years old, Nuno slipped away peacefully, his king and closest friends there to witness the end of a life that had shaped the destiny of Portugal. The tomb of Nuno Álvares Pereira was destroyed in the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. His epitaph read: Aqui jaz aquele famoso Nuno, o contestável, fundador da Sereníssima Casa de Bragança, excelente general, beato monge, que durante a sua vida na terra tão ardentemente desejou o reino dos céus, depois da morte, e mereceu a eterna companhia dos santos. As suas honras terrenas foram incontáveis, mas voltou-lhes as costas. Foi um grande príncipe, mas fez-se humilde monge. Fundou, construiu e dedicou esta igreja, onde descansa o seu corpo. Centuries passed, but the memory of Nuno never faded. For the people of Portugal, he had always been more than a national hero. He was someone touched by something greater, and eventually the Catholic Church agreed. Beatified in 1918, canonized as saint in 2009, Nuno Álvares Pereira remains not only a national hero, but a man of holiness, the invincible Portuguese warrior who became a saint. As for King John, he ruled longer than any monarch in Portugal's history, 48 years on the throne. During that time, he helped shape a kingdom that was stronger, more stable, and ready to look outward. Under his reign, Portuguese ships pushed farther and farther into the unknown. They discovered new islands, sailed down the coast of Africa, and ventured beyond the edges of every European map. It was the dawn of what the world would one day call the Age of Discovery. But that age, while filled with new horizons and bold voyages, also brought a darker legacy. It led to conquest, slavery, and the suffering of countless people, realities that will cast a long shadow over the centuries that followed. When King John died on August 14, 1433, at the age of 76, he left behind more than a crown. He left behind a spark, the idea of a kingdom that could push beyond its shores and change the world. For the next 200 years, his dynasty ruled Portugal. From Lisbon's docks, ships sailed to every corner of the globe, building an empire that would one day stretch across 5 continents. It was an era of ambition, adventure, and harsh consequences, both for those who left and for those whose lands were taken. But power, like the tide, always turns. In 1518 the dynasty fell, taking Portugal's independence with it. And yet, Portugal rose again. The nation reclaimed its independence. But that, as they say, is another story.